I won't go into this in great detail because I want to plow on. But for those of you who don't know, the University of the Arts London is kind of medium-sized UK university that's made up of 6 different art and design colleges. So we are the biggest creative art and design focused higher education institution in Europe, possibly in the world. I like to say we've got around 22,000 students all studying subjects that don't have a correct answer. So it has its own pedagogical challenges, but it's a fascinating place to work at. And you might have heard of some of those colleges, even if you haven't heard of the University of the Arts London. So I just want to ask you a quick question. If you can drop your answer into the chat. So whether you teach or whether you've been learning, you could broaden this out to just being online. But what do you miss the most when teaching or learning online? What's gone? You know, what's missing compared with face to face? If you want to drop your answer into the text chat, the physical component. Yeah. I'll just give you sort of 60 seconds to have a think about it. Yeah. Sometimes I do this on a whiteboard. I thought today it was just as easy to do it in the chat. Yeah. Okay. So what's coming up? A lot of it's got to do with being embodied. Some of it's got to do with different forms of maybe being social, the liminal, the informal. I quite like that one about eye contact. I mean, obviously, even if you're looking at somebody else's video feed, you're sort of not really making eye contact. Coffee machine is a good answer. That is a good answer, although it might have been good that we haven't been able to get to the coffee machine. I think I'm drinking more coffee now these days, actually, anyway. No time lag. Yeah, I think the kind of fluidity as well. So from our point of view at the University of Arts London, but I think this is sort of universal, I'd focus this down to the pub. Well, again, the pub in a way is that kind of liminal or informal space which is adjacent to the kind of formal part of the teaching and learning. So I think about this in terms of materiality. You know, we've got a lot of making courses, but I just really like to make the point that, you know, there's a real link between arts and the sciences, is that a lot of lab-based courses face exactly the same challenges as the art courses do, because you're literally working with your body, working with your hands. So materiality and embodiment and a lack of biscuits. These are the main things that we've been struggling with over the pandemic. And I just really want to acknowledge that. I don't think there's any replacement for that, but it doesn't mean that online can't be, you know, online has different affordances, doesn't it? And so from my perspective, and I've been thinking about this a lot over the last 18 months, and having worked in this area for 20 years, I guess this has always been on my mind, is I feel like what we've lost is this is in the Chinati Foundation, actually, over in West Texas, because I was there in 2018. So now that was a place. It's a loss of place, okay? And that's what I want to focus on. And I think whether you know you're in say the compulsory education sector, high school, secondary school, or whether you're in further education or higher education, this idea of place is really, really important. When the pandemic hit, we suddenly had a lot of our places sort of removed from us, and we moved to online. And I think in some ways we struggled to recreate the sense of place that we had, okay? And so that's in the background of what I'm talking about, is that's the sort of headline point that I want to make. And how do we recreate a sense of place, and why is that important? So some of you probably heard of the idea of digital natives and digital immigrants that was put forward by Mark Prensky around about 2000. That metaphor became quite dangerous because it's sort of attractive in the sense that it created this, everybody likes a generation gap. And so what it came to mean was old people don't understand technology, but young people sort of do automatically. But we didn't consider for what, or what their actual literacies were within that. And so a few years ago, I came up with an alternative metaphor, which proved to be quite useful. And I want to share that with you today, because it is actually effectively a place-based metaphor. And what I proposed as an alternative was the idea of visitors and residents. So I'm just going to outline that metaphor very quickly, and then use that as a way of talking about how we can respond sort of pedagogically to being online, and what that means for how we design teaching, how we design learning, how we design education. So visitors and residents, it's not two people, it's about sort of modes of engagement, if you like, or modes of presence, you could say. And it's a continuum, it's not just two boxes. So it's a sliding scale. But the easiest way of explaining it is to explain either end of the continuum, okay? So I'm not trying to type people, I'm trying to, if you like, define different modes of engagement. So at one end of the continuum is this visitor mode, and this is where the easiest way to think of this is you're almost imagining the web as a series of tools. So imagine the web as a series of, like an untidy toolbox. You decide what you want, and you rummage around, you find the tool that you want, you use it, and you put it back, and you close the toolbox. Okay, so you're literally visiting different locations online. There's some examples on the slide there. The key thing is that you're not leaving a social trace. Now, you'll be leaving a data trace. And what's interesting is in recent years, people have started to really come to an understanding of just how powerful that is, and in some cases sort of divisive, but you don't leave a social trace. At the other end of the continuum, in resident mode, you're literally living out part of your life online. Now, I actually proposed this idea in 2008. At that point, the idea of living out part of your life online was seen as quite wacky. It was just the crazy techie people or the scary online gamers. Now, I'd argue that pretty much all of us are in resident mode for quite a lot of the time, okay? It's now not an unusual thing. And the pandemic has forced us to essentially live online, hasn't it? So in resident mode, you're seeing the web as a series of spaces or places, and you're going online to engage with other people or to be co-present with other people. That's your motivation to go online, okay? So, a conference like this is to a certain extent resident, because the reason that you're attending is to be around other people. But in other aspects, it's in visitor mode, isn't it? Because you might come online, keep your camera and microphone off, not leave a social trace apart from your name. So we've got quite a lot of control over that. I think what's important is that you do leave a social trace in resident mode, and so what remains, that trace of you is attached to your identity as a person. It might be an alternative identity, or it might be a professional identity, it might be a personal identity, but nevertheless it's attached. And that became quite a useful way of thinking about how we engage online. And what you could do with it is we immediately found that context was really, really important. So, it's as simple as saying the way that we engage online in a personal context is different from, say, a professional or an institutional one. That seems quite straightforward. But a few years ago, I don't think we really treated students that way. We imagined students just had a single identity. And, you might remember where educational institutions would go, well, all the students are in Facebook, so let's just all pile into Facebook and do teaching in there. At which point the students go, whoa, what are you doing in here? This is our place. Why are you? It's a bit like your students, if you're in higher education, will go to the pub after lecture, as was mentioned. I mean, if you just appeared and went, hey, what's going on, guys? That's actually quite jarring unless you've already built up a relationship with people. So we add the context to it, and then it allows us to create maps like this one, where people can actually write down the platforms, the software, however you want to think of it, the kind of digital spaces and tools that they use against that kind of personal, institutional, or visitor and resident. And you get maps like this. I like the SharePoint one. We didn't ask people to put smiley faces on, but obviously that person hated SharePoint, fair enough. And then you get sort of more creative versions. People sketch it, people use Postit Notes. We've done this, you know, hundreds of people have done this all over the place. That's a super arty one that I thought I'd put up, seemed appropriate. And that mapping, you can go to my blog and find out how to do that mapping process. But I think what's significant about it is that essentially it's thinking of the digital in a kind of place-based way. And I think that's quite useful. So rather than thinking about it in a kind of instrumental or functional way, it's thinking about it more as a space or a place where the point of it is being co-present, especially up at the resident end of things. Okay, so there's a whole workshop around that where everybody does the mapping, and I think that the strength of it is not specifically the maps themselves, but the conversations that the maps engender, because the same platform can end up at a completely different place on different people's maps depending on how they engage. So if you're going to be resident, if you're going to be in the resident mode, then you're going to be present in some form, social presence perhaps. And I think that presence is actually become really, really important. I think, you know, what people have missed is different modes of presence. Buildings, physical buildings, I think of as co-presence machines. Most educational buildings are co-presence machines. The whole point of going there is to be co-present with other people. And suddenly we lost that. And we've got in the digital space, we've got these different modes of potential presence, these different modes of being around each other, different modes of working, perhaps more modes than we have normally when we're in a building, which is quite interesting. I mean, my view is actually being forced online actually gives our students more choices about how they engage and more choices about how they disengage, depending on how we design what we're doing with them. And in some cases, like students choosing to switch their cameras off, occasionally we hear about that as being a negative thing. But actually, if you think about it, what's happening there is the students actually have more agency in that space than they would do in the face-to-face world. I'm pretty certain that if you asked a room full of undergraduates in a lecture theatre, that if they could have the option to switch their face off, would they? They'd say yes. So, you know, it's intriguing, isn't it? How actually the digital shifts the power dynamic in some ways, doesn't it? So we've got synchronous forms of presence. We've got asynchronous forms of presence, very important, you know, where people are sort of present through content or the things that they've left behind. There's collaborative forms of presence, there's social presence, and then one that I think is really, really difficult to perpetuate or to facilitate online is this ambient presence. So a good example of that is in the previous slide, you know, that image there. Certainly in higher education, but I'd argue at lots of level of education, we choose to go where other people are to do our work. You know, our students, they want to come onto campus, into the colleges, to be in the library, to be in our learning zones, not necessarily to talk to people, but just to be around people. It's inspiring and it's motivating. So yeah, it's been a difficult time. Sure, I'm just responding to the chat. And so I guess what I'm sort of promoting is that for education to work well when it's online and when it's blended, it needs a mix of these different kinds of presence, some of which our buildings sort of did. Some of these forms of presence came for free by just being embodied in being a building. I think when it's digital, we have to design it back in. Okay, so I've got some examples. So that I don't go too metaphoric and too sort of conceptual, just want to bring it back down here to some examples, if you like, that have come out of well, just the last few years, but more specifically institutional research that we've done over the pandemic. The first one was really fascinating to me. So what we found, and I don't think anybody would be surprised by this, anybody who's tried teaching in these spaces that we've got available to us like this one, is if you put students or anyone in a small breakout room and give them a task or something to think about, they'll get into the room and immediately they'll be a little bit uncomfortable. People might switch the cameras off and somebody will go, what are we supposed to be doing? And then there'll be a bit of a silence. What some of our academics have found, our teaching staff have found, is that actually quite often the students wouldn't do the activity, but they'll have a lovely little chat and get to know each other. So what's happened there is that we've, you know, driven by a kind of small group mentality, if you like, which is quite positive, we've created a kind of informal space, and it's been co-opted to be used socially. And I quite like the idea of giving students just kind of almost a tokenistic thing just to get them talking, and then put them in these small spaces, because a lot of them have never met each other face to face. It was sort of mind-blowing to me to realize that you know, people talk about either going back to normal, you know, what the institution was like before the pandemic, or what should we hold on to as we exit the pandemic. And somebody said to me, yeah, but for a lot of your students, the institution is what it is now. They've only experienced the institution during the pandemic. That's what your university is. There's no previous version of it. There's no next version of it. And so we've really got to work with the practices that we've invented. So there's that one. Validating and not owning student spaces. This is probably more relevant at higher education level. Yeah, absolutely, Katie. I think we really craved social interaction. Everybody did. And one of the things I'm most proud of, outside of controversies about people paying fees and things being online, is that everybody in education has perpetuated something that has been a real lifeline, like something to do during the pandemic. It's been a focus. I think that's been really important. I think we should be proud of that, you know, even if it's been bumpy and it hasn't been ideal. So validating not owning student spaces, the students will set up WhatsApp groups, whatever it might be. Now, you don't have to have anything to do with them, but if you know of their existence, you can say, hey, you should probably join that. And you validate, you sort of authenticate the group, but you don't own it. There's always this habit to institutionalize and formalize, but actually it's important that some of these things are kind of liminal and on the edge. And that's what I mean about, that's a very highfalutin phrase, architecting liminal spaces. But I think, you know, where we say, well, there's no conversation in the corridor, was because we haven't built a corridor. So build the corridor, call it the corridor, and say, if you want to have a quiet chat, we've got this digital space here, which is now the corridor. And sometimes that works. Sometimes it doesn't work, because actually it needs to be owned by the students. Sometimes it helps if it's sort of built by us. And then this idea of leaving a trace, which I think is really important. So many of the places, online places that we use, it's really difficult to feel resident, and it's really difficult to feel any sense of ownership in those spaces, because we don't leave anything behind. You know, next time you come into the Zoom room, it's just a blank canvas again. Now that's very different from a physical space, whereas technologies like Miro, Mural, Padlet, plenty of others, you know, as long as that space survives between sessions, if you like, then students can put all kinds of stuff in them. And when they go back, the stuff is there and it's still laid out in the way that they can make a giant mess if they want. And that helps you feel like it's an actual place. Okay. So there's just some examples. Here's some examples from my institution. We've got this is Mahara, which is an open source portfolio platform, which we've modified quite extensively. This is just the homepage, which sort of tiles together random student portfolios. And I think what's important here is that, you know, this, depending on how it's used, this makes students' work visible to each other. And I think that's really, really important. You know, we have this studio culture. One of the most powerful things about the studio culture is that when you walk through the building, you see everybody's work, so you get to know people through their work. Okay, it's one of the ways that people express their presence. Okay, so presence through work. And a key thing when we think about community, any kind of successful community, is it is it has a focus, it has a work, it has a shared endeavor, which I'll come back round to at the end. You know, if it's a football club, we were talking about that because of the Euros, there's the game of football. There's tons of stuff around that, but it has this kind of shared focal point. I think sometimes when we go digital in education, we forget that and we say, hey, students, here's a space for you to be a community in. But we don't necessarily create that kind of the shared endeavor that that community is going to be focused around, which is kind of what pedagogy should be, I think. Anyway, there's an example. Really messy whiteboards. I'm a fan of a messy whiteboard. I really like that. And I think there's something about when people try and use the little pen thing and everything comes out wonky. There's something really human in that. I'm also a fan, I don't have an example as a slide, of asking people to sketch things and then take a photo on their phone and then upload it, because handwriting, hand-drawn sketches bring the sort of the humanity into the digital space, you know, and you can feel the presence of individuals. This was one of my favorite sessions that I did last year, which is not radical, but you know, I just asked people to pile into this mural board, and the conference session was just asking these 3 questions, and while I was talking, people were putting Post-it notes up. And you know, that was enough of a shared endeavor. You could see where people were, you could feel, oh, that person's sort of over there and that person's sort of over there, so it spatialized it, you know. And I think these platforms that have a kind of spatial element, we've missed that as well. So that's Mural, that one. Yeah, exactly. And the previous comment about the WhatsApp group and that being informal, it's a delicate balance, but you know, as I said, I think we can support that. So I think what I call sort of these sort of schematic spatial environments are really, really powerful, because they help people feel like they've been somewhere together, right? Yes, Jamboard's a good one. And then lastly, slightly left field, this is somebody doing a camera workshop. Not everybody can have a setup like this, but if this room wasn't so wonky, I'd pick my camera up and show you things from, but I mean, even if I just do this, I'm only a little box, right? So here's me talking from the side. There's something sort of, I mean, obviously it feels a bit weird now, but there's something really refreshing about just not seeing somebody face on. And I really like hands, you know, so a lot of our tutors will have a second camera that's facing down, and they'll draw and they'll sketch and they'll take things apart, and that really gives a, you know, that re-embodies people, I think, in a really interesting way. Because, and this would be my point on this, I think that environments like Zoom, Teams, Collaborate, Skype, whatever you might be, Hangouts, where you've got this sort of grid of people just head on, actually fits quite well with this idea of a non-place, which Marc Auger proposed a little while ago. So this is about super modernity. So a good example of a sort of physical non-place, which I really like, is, say, the baggage collection hall in an airport. It's a place, but really it's it's not really, it's a space, but it's not a place, right? And I think what happened is we piled into technologies like Zoom, and we thought, well, that must be a place because I can see everyone. But actually, it's a non-place, and that's why it can feel a bit distancing, okay? Because you don't own anything in that place. It's constantly shifting around. You can't even tell where people's videos are on each other's screens, right? So it's not as shared a location. We're not as co-present in it as we might like to imagine. So you can feel really unpresent in these spaces. So I think of this as a non-place. It's helpful, does a useful job, but I don't think it's a place. It definitely doesn't replace what it feels like to be in a room together. Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point, Evelyn, or Eveline. I think you're saying something very nuanced there that I probably haven't got time to get into, but obviously that relationship between object and person, and between person and person, is something that we're very keen on in my institution. Not only would I say it's not by default a place, but for ethical reasons, I think probably everybody has the right to switch their camera and microphone off, not especially when something's being recorded. And so then you get this sort of double hit where it's not really a place, but also you can't see anyone. So it's like a double not place. And I know people, educators have really, really struggled with that. So the question then is, I guess my point is that we have to find more, we have to use some of those other modes of presence to create a sense of co-presence and to create a sense of place. We can't just rely on the idea that if I can see someone's face, then they're present. I think this applies across the board, to be honest with you. Many of us will have given talks to rooms full of people, and we know that half of those people are embodied but not present. They're checked out, right? So I think I wrote that embodiment is a powerful but false proxy for presence. But we're obviously, we live in our bodies, so they're very powerful things. And so we imagine if we can see someone, then they must be with us. But I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that's a dangerous principle. And then we have to think about ideas of what makes something a safe place. There's a lot of talk about safe space, safe place in education, and I worry that that's often means private, when in actual fact you've got to ask who's the place really safe for. There's been some, so how do you build trust in a group of students? How do you build trust when you're in a physical room? How do you build trust when you're in an online space? There's been some really interesting things coming back about perhaps it's a whole different community of students that suddenly feel comfortable to engage because there are different modes of engagement when we're online. Perhaps, face-to-face teaching tends to, certainly at our institution, we've got really international cohorts of students. I'd say face-to-face fundamentally privileges people who have English as a first language rather than as an additional language, whereas perhaps typing and the pseudonymity of some of the digital spaces really, really helps other students to engage. So that's why we need the mix, okay? So, second question is, what practices have you used or do you know of that make a teaching location, it could be online or face-to-face, into a place of trust or a safe place? I'll just give you a second to think about that because it's quite a big question, isn't it? I now realize. What does it mean for something to be safe? Because, and the reason I mention it is because unless people feel reasonably safe, then they're not going to volunteer to be present, if you see what I mean. Yeah, being known. I think that just zipped up. I've got to extend the window because this is coming in quickly now. I think knowing that you're known, that's come up time and time again. There's a really long answer there, which I am going to read. Little interactions, yeah, like micro interactions. I think social presence and social interactions, acknowledging each other as social beings is really, really important, which is obviously in tension with, I've got a lot of material I've got to get through. Yeah, so Evelyn, that I agree. And I think that my answer to this question, I'm scrolling through some more. Yeah, establishing that we'll make mistakes. Yeah, so putting cameras and mics on does increase social presence. So it's a really live debate, isn't it? But I think my point is, how do you need to create enough trust that people want to put their camera and mic on, don't you? So fundamentally trying to build trust becomes really, really important for presence. Encouraging experiment. I'd say on that one, about encouraging experiment, quite often it's about making yourself vulnerable as the teacher or the academic. So with that mapping process that I showed you, I'll quite often do my map first, and it looks really messy. And then everybody goes, oh, I'll do mine then. It can't look worse than that. You know, so I think sometimes we ask our students to be a lot more vulnerable than we're prepared to make ourselves. But if we make ourselves vulnerable through our practices, then I think that kind of opens the door for people to connect and people to engage. A really good example of this was an academic at my institution said that she plays music at the start of sessions, but she plays music that she really likes. And then she talks about why she really likes it. And it actually makes you quite vulnerable, doesn't it? Sort of going, this is music I really like. This is, you know, but it gets people talking, people start sharing their music, you know. But just coming back on the long comment there, just to sort of finish this thought, and then I'm going to move on, is I'd say that the concept of safe place has to be negotiated. It's a live negotiated practice. It's not just the sort of context or the conditions of the location. It's not the same as being able to lock the door. I mean, for many students, I mean, imagine if you went into a lecture theatre and turned around and locked the door. That would suddenly feel like an unsafe space, wouldn't it? So I think my point about safe place would be that it needs to be actively negotiated with everybody who's involved. And that takes time, and that can make you vulnerable, but also I think it's just a valuable thing to learn, that process. And you need time as well. It doesn't happen instantly. I think it's a really hard thing to do if you're with a group of students only for 20 minutes and then that's it. So I think for me, place, this is what I'm taking away from the pandemic. Place is socially and pedagogically constructed, right? So Zoom isn't a place by default, but the way that we teach and the way that we interact can make it feel like a place. So the moments when that text chat is coming in, suddenly it feels a little bit more like a place than when it's just me talking, for example, which is why I quite like people text chatting, because it helps me as well. And the way these things click together is that you can't be present unless there's a place to be present in, okay? And presence makes somewhere feel like a place. So there's this really interesting kind of symbiotic relationship between these two ideas. Now, that's all fine, but you know, you've got to teach people something. You've got curriculum to get through. There's a lot of material. The discipline will always expand to fill all available space. But I'd argue that if you start with the principle of presence, especially if you're blended or online, but if you start with the principle of presence in terms of how you design curriculum and how you design how you interact with students, then the other things will flow, if you like. The engagement will be there. Students are more likely to engage with material outside of those, you know, moments or whatever it might be. And so it's not just an arts thing, and it's not just a higher education thing. But it takes time, and I think I really want to acknowledge very quickly, because we're running out of time here, that actually if the model of education is predicated around content delivery, then there's never going to be enough time to do the facilitation required to create the trust, to create the place, right? And I think actually educational institutions often don't really acknowledge this. They sort of hope that it's going to happen for free. But I think what we found over the pandemic is how fundamentally important it is to, you know, the amount of students that I know that our academics have been doing much more pastoral work. There's been much more well-being work. There's been much more human, because people looked to the institution to sort of become that place in their lives. But that doesn't happen for free. It takes an awful lot of time, and I'm sure anybody who's taught will understand what I'm talking about. So we need to move away. In the UK, we talk about contact hours and preparation time. But actually, I think what we need to talk about is modes of presence. You know, what are the various modes of presence that are in your model that the students can engage with, and how do you respect the time it takes to generate, you know, a sense of coming together, a sense of co-presence rather than just moving material around. So I'm not going to speak to this slide in detail because I've only got a couple of minutes back, but I just wanted to come down to some really practical things. And this is, well, then practical sort of strategic things. So I think the one that I'll just pick for now is this idea of co-design of curriculum. I think that actually the pandemic has really, I think people have found for themselves that really well-designed blended learning requires a lot of design. And perhaps we don't give people the time to do that. But what we've done in my institution is brought in many more kind of digital learning designers to work with course teams to do that design work. We can't expect everyone to be an expert overnight. So I'm just going to read the chat. Yeah, I think what you're doing there, Tracy, is that's an example of what I'd call a kind of care-based approach. You're demonstrating that you care about people and you want to hear from them, and you're connected. You're saying, hey, you weren't there. Yeah, self-determination and agency is critical to the way that we operate at UAL. So yeah, I just want to acknowledge that it's easy for me to talk about this. It's quite difficult to do, and it's quite difficult to find the time to do the design to do it well. And actually, we probably need to remodel our institutions. Fundamentally, unless you believe education is a shared endeavor between everyone involved, none of this makes any sense. Okay. And I've been in various talks and conferences where you just sort of feel like, yeah, that's good pedagogically, but the philosophy of the institution, and you have to make this clear to students as well. This is a shared endeavor. Okay. If it's just a service, if it's a product, none of what I've said makes any sense at all. If it's seen as a kind of shared co-construction of knowledge or some kind of shared creative act, which I believe that most higher education should be, then it makes sense. And you can pick where you stand with that. The mileage varies on that. And just lastly, no, second to lastly, because I'm out of time, this is the model that's in the background of what I've been talking about. Everybody's got their own Venn diagram. I put bright colors on mine. I hope that makes it fun. This is my Venn diagram on this. I'm really interested in pedagogy as placemaking. It's definitely up the arts and humanities ends of things, but I'd say it applies across the board. We want our students to feel like they belong. And to do that, I think ultimately we need an expanded definition of teaching. One of the things I've found is that perhaps incoming students, first-year undergraduates, when you say, how did you find the teaching on your course? They'll only talk about when somebody is talking to them live. But teaching has to come, and these modes of presence are broader than that. And we need to shift the cultural perception of what education is to be broader as well. Otherwise, we miss all the good stuff that comes with digital. And it just becomes a kind of deficit model and a kind of, how can we make this as much like face-to-face as possible, even if the face-to-face pedagogy wasn't that great. I'll stop there because I know we're out of time. And actually, I'm at the end, so that's not bad. Thank you for engaging with those questions. Thank you for your chat there. I know that in a few minutes, there's time for a Q&A, so there's plenty of time to sort of chew over some of this stuff.
Well, Dave, perfect. Thank you very much for your talk. Very interesting. And I think there are tons of questions because you raised a lot of points here and a lot of discussion we can have about how to build that. And what's, for example, also the plan behind a learning platform. Should they be rebuilt, or what is privacy issues if you work with all this social software and you bundle them to a learning environment? How does that work? There are lots of questions we can ask you, but we have to hold them until 6, at least in European time, 6 p.m. In 15 minutes. It's in 15 minutes. It's also in room 1, I think.
So, I think is it this room? Is it the same room?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I think so. So I'm not sure. I think some people need a coffee or want to go to a different session, but others will be around. So maybe you can already get some questions. So ask for some questions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy just to carry on through if people, I mean, obviously if people need to take a break, take a break, but I'm here now, so I don't know how you want to handle filtering questions.
Oh, you can do it yourself. If you look in the chat and then just ask people to turn on their microphone. It's possible to unmute yourself.
Okay, well, I think what I'll do then is if anybody, if there are questions that people put into text chat that I didn't get to, then take this opportunity now to get on the mic and ask me that question. I just open it up.
Tankers, may I ask you one question, please?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm Bakano from Ethiopia. And then thank you for your interesting presentation. You see, I'm a bit in a different context that, because of different reasons, and then it was not easy for many higher education here to shift to online. And things are a bit challenging. Therefore, how do you see the differences in the two parts of the world, because yeah, still things are different here around that, yeah, I can see some differences. What you are presenting, that's very interesting. We have to move to that direction, but still we have many problems when it comes to such practices. Yeah.
Where are you based?
What?
Where are you based?
I'm from Africa, Ethiopia.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's fair to say that, my institution is based out of London. It's a reasonably affluent institution, and I also think there's the thing about art schools is they're fundamentally in this kind of experimental and disruption mode. So when a giant disruption came along, it was like, oh, this is home territory. So I feel like we're quite disorganized, but actually that's an advantage in an emergency because we just adapted because we're kind of in this permanent adaptation mode anyway. I think that it is difficult to imagine. I mean, some of the things I'm talking about are really aspirational for my institution as well. I wouldn't want to give the impression that we're just doing all of that. It happens in various ways in various places. But what I would say is that I think that under any circumstances, finding ways to focus on presence is useful. And if you've got large student numbers, so some of our courses are really big, I think that's a fundamental aspect to it. It was easier for the smaller courses to adapt, but if you've got 600 students, it's quite difficult to do. But what I would say is start with the idea of students making their work visible to each other. I think that can work in almost any context. It's a relatively straightforward thing to do technologically. Kind of within the culture of a course or an institution, the students can feel quite vulnerable sharing their work. And so you have to be careful with that. Because let's imagine, so if we set this in the context of very traditional education, quite often the students will never see each other's work because they'll do the homework, they'll hand it into the tutor will mark it, and then they'll take it back, right? So it becomes this entirely private thing. Whereas I think as soon as students can see each other's work, they feel like they're part of a group, they can feel it because they know that everybody's facing the same challenges and some of them will be finding similar solutions. So that's step one. I think step two is then asking students to share work in progress. And that's much harder. But actually, if you can get students to share work in progress and say, well, I'm halfway through this, I'm not sure whether I'm on the right track. What do you guys think? And then their fellow students can comment. If you can create that culture, then everybody learns so much more. And I think that can be done without necessarily messing with assessment criteria, And I think it can be done with, as I say, with really, really big cohorts of students. So that's where I'd start, is making work visible to each other. And then next step, making the process of the work. We struggle with that. A lot of our students, their initial reaction is, I want to make the perfect thing, and then I'll show my group. I mean, we're all like that, aren't we? But if you could say, no, we want to see the half-built thing, and we're going to have a chat about that because that's where the learning is, then that can be really refreshing. I'll go back to the vulnerability thing. If you do the work as well and you show your half-made thing, or slightly broken thing, or something that's not quite right, if you do that, then the students will really start to share, I believe. I hope that's a helpful answer.
Thank you.
There's still things coming in on the chat, but I'd recommend, now we're in this mode, if you put something in the chat that you're interested to explore, then do get on the mic. I invite people to be brave. Hit the unmute button.
Hello, this is Gerald Knezik from University of North Texas. Thank you for a very nice talk. I was very intrigued by the point where you reached when you stopped, about new ways of thinking about teaching, and especially related to some of the former comments about place versus presence, or at least that's what I've put together. I was thinking about George Orwell, and I believe he was the one with the teaching walls. And perhaps I've gotten that confused with 1984 Brave New World, and I get them mixed up sometimes. Nevertheless, we've been in a world for a year of basically the teaching walls, but it doesn't feel the same as face-to-face. And so the science fiction writers got it a little bit wrong, in my opinion. I was really intrigued by your new thoughts to me today on being in constant turmoil. So the last year felt normal. There is something to that. Could you expand a little bit on new ways of teaching?
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways we can look. Thanks for the question. I mean, there are different ways that we can look at new ways of teaching. I guess at my institution, then we'd have lectures and seminars, which you'd recognize across any discipline, really. And then we'd have studio space and workshops. So studio space where students create their work responding to a creative brief. Workshops where perhaps they'll learn processes and practices, I know, for photography, printmaking, 3D fabrication. I think that fundamentally it goes back to this notion of contact hours, which I didn't speak to that much. Pretty much all of education is conceptualized as being in a room with somebody talking to you or at you in some form. And I think that with digital modes, there's lots of asynchronous modes, there's text-based ways of interacting. You can interact through posting material, you can interact through just these lots of different modes, and so many of them aren't a contact hour, if you like. And so I think that's what we need to reconsider if we're going to sort of de-Orwell, if you like, the digital space, because otherwise, I'll go back to the start of the pandemic, and something happened that I call practice mirroring, and it's completely understandable. It is not a criticism, it's completely understandable. Okay, so what in design, you get this thing called skeuomorphism, don't you, whereby the new thing resembles the old thing, because we haven't been able to imagine our way out of that paradigm. So early cars looked like a horse-drawn carriage without the horse, right? The save icon looks like a diskette, but you ask anybody who's younger than 30 what that icon is, they'll go, oh, the save. I heard a great story where somebody showed a diskette to their kid, and they went, oh, you've 3D printed the save icon, right? So which makes sense, doesn't it, right? So what happened at the start of the pandemic was we did practice mirroring, and we tried to perpetuate the timetable. So if we had 4 hours of teaching in a face-to-face room on a Tuesday afternoon. We just had 4 hours of Zoom on a Tuesday afternoon, and everybody was exhausted because somewhere in our mind, we just went, what's the closest equivalent to what we've just lost? Let's perpetuate that rather than let's redesign within the affordances of these new locations we've got. And nobody had time for that. Fair enough. But I think we're beginning to head that way. So in terms of new ways of conceptualizing teaching, it hangs on that for me, which is that we can't just model education around how many contact hours there are and how much independent study there is. There has to be something that's more nuanced around, I don't know, answering emails, facilitating a text discussion, running something in Padlet or Mural or Miro. And so for me, as I've mentioned, the paradigm for me is more, instead of there just being either there's a contact hour or nothing, there has to be these slightly more nuanced definitions of modes of teaching. So what I want is I want our students, when they reflect on the course and you say, how was the teaching on the course? They'll go, well, we had this really, really great shared portfolio space where we were all posting our work and commenting on each other's work, right? And the tutor was commenting, and he'd come in twice a week and comment on the work. And sometimes he was there at the same time as us, and sometimes he wasn't. What we've got right now is quite literally, students said, if somebody's talking to them or at them live in a room like this, that's teaching. If they watch the recording of that, that's not teaching. Even if the experience is identical, because it's completely not interactive. So what does that mean? That would mean, I don't know. Does that mean reading from a book isn't learning? I don't know. Do you see what I mean? So we've got to start loosening that up, but we need to loosen it up. Sorry, this is a long answer, but I'm quite passionate about this. It's a good question. Is we need to loosen it up by expanding the cultural understanding of what education is. And this is a game where I'm really, really not critical of our students. They come into our institution and their understanding of what university is largely comes from films and novels. And you think of any portrayal of university in you know, that kind of entertainment media, and it's somebody in a big room talking to a bunch of people. And yeah, they're charismatic and they're wearing a jacket a bit like this, and maybe a student will say something that's a bit naughty, but that's it. That is it, right? And so they're bringing in this very, very narrow cultural understanding of what it means to engage. And it's our job to extend their understanding of that very quickly. I think back in the day when I went to university, I discovered that for myself, but it took 1.5 years. That was sort of fine back then. Right now, we need to be having that discussion straight off, and then they'll sort of discover it themselves. Does that answer? Does that? Great. That was like a little micro.
Thank you very much.
Again. Sorry about that.
Next keynote, I hope, will be about that.
Okay, I'll focus on that. That's good advice. Thank you. See, I'm learning.
Yeah, thanks much.
Okay. What else have we? Does anybody else want to jump onto the mic? Has anybody got a question that perhaps it is in the chat that you might want to bring into the room via the mic?
I have a quick comment that how you ended the session, that we need to extend the definition of teaching. So it reminds me of CRT. It's a cultural responsive teaching. That's a pedagogy that recognizes the importance of including students' cultural references in all aspects of learning. So I was just thinking that it is so important. And I think it is a new avenue for the research, that how are we preparing our teachers that they will respond students' cultural references in online class. I think this component is missing, that when teachers are teaching, like you mentioned, that 3 or 4 hours of contact, but where the cultural responsive teaching, that component is missing because it's just the content delivery. So I was just thinking from that perspective that it's so important to expand the definition of teaching from cultural perspectives.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, really, Selma. And that is a really, really live topic in my institution at the moment, and will be for years and years. And you know, I'd argue that along the lines that you're mentioning, that if we believe that education should be a shared endeavor, then it has to absolutely be transcultural, if you like. It has to be able to respond to and adapt to what our students bring and what our staff bring. With they'll have, you know, and there's a richness to that. So I mean, some people see it as a like a problem or a barrier, but I see it as a potential richness. It's especially the case with some of the subjects that we teach. You know, we want to bring in the sort of different knowledges, different aesthetics, different cultural influences. We're just about to launch a course and a master's in transcultural collaboration, which is very much about, you know, it's fundamentally about that philosophy. But even more importantly than that, you know, we have an attainment gap, which sometimes we call an awarding gap, which means that students that come from Black ethnic minority groups actually just receive lower marks on average than our white students. This is all openly published. It's part of our regulatory requirement to close that gap. And we think that one of the major reasons for that gap is because our student body is more diverse than our staff body. There's too many people that look and sound like me as members of staff. And so we are recruiting academic staff to so that there's more diversity in the staff body. But fundamentally, yes, I think that sort of goes back to my point about safe space having to be a negotiation amongst everybody who's there. It's a really difficult thing to do, I recognize, if perhaps you're in the school system where there's a very, very rigorous curriculum, which is nationally defined. But I like to think, until somebody puts cameras in every classroom, that the classroom is still a place where we can stretch the curriculum to be more inclusive. I mean, I've got grown-up kids now, but they went through the school system in the UK, and I know that their curriculum was designed to present a very particular cultural understanding of what the UK is that wasn't entirely representative. And so, yeah, absolutely. And the same with digital spaces. And there's something really interesting going on, which is who owns the space. You know, I was talking about this idea of Nonplace. So Zoom is owned by a company in China. It's a big corporate company. We've been using Microsoft Teams a lot. You know, if pre-pandemic somebody had said, well, we've employed Microsoft, they're going to come in and build a new college building and then you're going to use it, everybody would have really kicked back against that. But effectively, we've all piled into Microsoft's space. So you can also ask the question, who owns the space and who controls the space? The answer is Silicon Valley, isn't it? And Silicon Valley doesn't have the best representation on inclusivity either. So I think it's our job as educators to, I use the phrase connect a diversity of voices. You know, my favorite quote about, it comes from George Siemens, my favorite quote about education ever is, teachers are the arbiter of connections, which is a great philosophy to respond to what you're saying. Thanks for that. I think that's a really important area.
Thank you, Dr. White, for your response on it.
Yeah, now, I'm not a doctor. I just look like one, which is also part of my response to your question. So I'm joking now. I'm officially joking now. But what's the easiest way to get a PhD is to sort of look like you probably already have one. Anyway, what else have we got?
I did have a question. If you had any research that you could share that supported this idea, which I love, of expanding what contact hours look like and expanding teaching expectations, especially in post-secondary.
Yeah, I don't, I mean, it's sort of work in progress at the moment. And in a way, most of what I've been talking about is my very live reaction to what I've seen during the pandemic. And so that, and I see the pandemic as a catalyst for things that were already there. So where it's starting to exist is less in academic journals and things like that. And I could find some and share it back with the conference, but it's more reports that have come out of bodies like the Office for Students and the QAA, these kind of almost sort of regulatory bodies have really started to get their heads around this. So there's a really live discussion about, well, how do we go beyond this idea of contact hours? Now, at the moment, I think it's really nascent, actually, because the best we've got officially is digital can also be part of contact hours, but that isn't very helpful because what does that really mean? So yeah, I don't have anything really solid for you academically. It's me thinking on my feet at this point.
So you're prompting us to do research.
I think the area would be a rich site of research, yes. I think that, I mean, here's what I really think about it, is I think there's all, I mean, I'm going to speak from my position in my job as head of digital education academic practice, is that on the one hand, I can imagine all kinds of research that would suggest all kinds of things. The question for me is, how do you embed it in an institution? How do you make it work? You know, the thing is that the reason we have contact hours, let's be honest, is because we sort of pay people by the hour. We pay them for their time because that's how we quantify, you know, that's how we quantify things. So the question that's in my mind is, could you create a model that moves away from contact hours, but also could be contractual without getting too dry about it? How can you go in this direction without quantifying it to the point that it kills the principle of the thing? You know, and sometimes these things are left deliberately vague. So we'll have for every hour of contact time, you have an hour and a half of prep time, but nobody says what prep time is. So I think there needs to be more nuance in there, but we've also got to leave it sort of open enough that it can be applied in ways that's really going to work at an institution.
So this reminds me of shifting from standardized assessments to more authentic assessments. And you're providing artifacts. You have to be accountable. And as long as you can account for this interaction and this professional presence, if you will, then you can validate that you are within the boundaries of the expectations of guiding and directing your students from your instructional directives for the course or program.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, but just being completely honest about it, there's no version of what I'm suggesting that isn't more expensive, you know, really. And I think that's where it gets difficult. So for example, along the lines you're talking about, we'll do what we call holistic assessment, where students will quite often submit a portfolio, and that's quite often digital. It's in that workflow platform, and the portfolio will demonstrate, I think of it as it tells the story of their work, the process, you know, what's influenced them, how have they pulled it together, what decisions have they made, what's the narrative and creative journey that led them to this sort of final artifact. Now, and over one of the good things about the pandemic, because it's been quite difficult to make final artifacts, is we've shifted the emphasis onto process and away from realization, which is, I think that's healthy because that's where the learning takes place. And then they'll write a short piece of reflective writing about their portfolio. Now, the reason I'm talking about that is because it's a little bit like you're suggesting. I think it's incredibly authentic. I think the students learn a lot, but it's really difficult to assess. It takes an enormous amount of time, right? There's a big difference between that and a multi-choice quiz. So I'm going to be totally honest. You know, it's expensive to go the route that I'm going.
Yeah, but for me it's the same. It's the same, because I will never ask multi-choice questions or nothing at all. They have, for I give 2 subjects, entrepreneurship. They had their models, and they have to be able to put them on example stories that I give. Or I give also intercultural communication. That's a core. So I'm working together with a university in Ethiopia and with Ghana, and we also have students from Thailand.
Mm-hmm.
And there, of course, it's really practical because they intercultural competences, that's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And there they have to make a portfolio. And indeed, it's about reflecting about themselves, how they work in the group, what were the problems, what did they learn from. And that's okay. It takes a lot of work for me to give points and to give grades, I mean, and to read everything. And for the last one, the core, I really took the course out of the learning platform. We're using Canvas, and I'm putting it on a learning community platform.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, it was also very easy to read on a smartphone, what was important for my students in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other side, yes, and indeed, I tried to, one of the task of assignments they have to do is, even when they didn't complete a task, they have to look for solutions for all the countries in groups, in intercultural and interdisciplinary groups, for challenges they saw within COVID. From all those countries. They have to talk about each other, and they have to post it and comment, and the other groups have to comment on it. And it was really, really nice. And that's it was about COVID-19, but the subject was learning to communicate and work with an intercultural group, and they did. And that's what matters. And it's a lot of work. And it was on a community. That means that's in the weekend and the evening, I was still chatting with students, but it's like that.
Yeah, yes, that sounds fantastic. And I guess in a way, in some ways, that's part of my point, is for you to make that happen, you were working way outside of your job.
Yeah.
And so I think I'm perhaps what I'm talking about is finding a middle ground whereby we acknowledge that that's what really rewarding education looks like, but we also create some kind of way of paying people for it, at least some of it. And in a way, I mean, I think I put a slide up with that tweet about, you know, about facilitating community, and how that it's a form of work that I think of as institutionally transparent, or it's invisible to the institution. And therefore it's quite difficult to reward. It's only fair that we pay people for their time. And so this is what we need to expand. We need to say, actually, really engaging education, especially transcultural education, the kind that you're talking about, requires facilitation and not transmission. But facilitation is a completely different model of working, isn't it? You don't just turn up and do your thing and then disappear, and then so it's about. And so then what happens is, this is why I like that quote about teachers being the arbiter of connections, because actually it kind of, when you unpack that, it's all inside that, is that if we go with that philosophy, then it requires this more engaged, more present, more active mode of being a teacher. And that's what I'd like to push towards, is sort of redefining what teaching is along those lines. But it's it's difficult. I'm pretty sure that whoever pays you couldn't afford to pay you the actual hours you worked on that.
Oh,
but I don't
know. Indeed, they never will. And it's because it was a new project, and I'm always into new projects. So I have my liberty to do whatever I want, I will say.
No, I mean, I think
true.
It's fantastic, but it's going to happen.
That's true. That's true. But in fact, I think there are possibilities, and I will not start to talk about that at the moment, because then I will talk about my my logic and everything about relating more than structural and peripheral relating instead of transactional relating, or positioning instead of conditioning, what we are doing now most of the time. But I think we can facilitate with data that we get on a digital way. We can facilitate the coach or the teacher to do that with even 1,000 or 2,000. We will do a project now in a hospital. It's another situation, but it's also on learning, and they have 25,000 employees, and we will do that. So it's possible.
I agree it's possible, and I agree that the data that comes from the platforms can be used in a sympathetic way towards that. I think what I'd say about it is it has to be designed in a way that's much more precise than perhaps a more traditional approach. And so I think the people that hold the key to this are the people who can design approaches to education with that philosophy that work at that scale. And my hope is partly what pandemic's done, is that institutions are beginning to recognize, instructional designers, I'd call them learning designers. I think institutions are beginning to recognize that as being a really, really important form of expertise. And it's because I find myself in this space as well. It's interesting to me that on the one hand, you've got this kind of idea of the sort of pure academic, who speaks about their research in a big lecture theatre and then disappears, or maybe has open office hours. At the other end, you've got IT who make computers work. The really tricky thing is that instructional designers, learning designers, they sort of exist somewhere in the middle. And I think our institutions are just a bit behind the curve on understanding how important that expertise is. But I think the pandemic's helped. I mean, you can't find a learning designer to employ in the UK now for love nor money, because they've all been kind of snapped up, because institutions suddenly realized how important somebody who can design that mode of engagement but at scale is. So it's quite hopeful that
but still I see that most of the tools I see, they are all on conditioning the environment, conditioning the person, and that's that can lead also to inactivity.
I think the question of the tools and the platforms is a separate one, but very important. I think in a really blunt way, I think that what I said about, say, first-year undergraduate students and their cultural understanding of education, I'd say that's roughly where most of Silicon Valley is as well. And so, what you see is, digital education environments, even the ones that are designed for higher education, seem to be designed for like 7-year-old students, where you're just trying to control them and stop a riot breaking out, which of course you don't have to do with 7-year-olds. But there's quite a long way to go on that. I think it's co-optable. I think where I see it working really well, it's a bit like that example I showed of the Mural Board, is where you're using like a bricolage of tools. So maybe you're in Zoom, but actually you're sharing a Miro or a Mural Board, and that's where you're working. So I think the way that it's a bit like the way that you moved out of Canvas, but you probably still have to link back into it. So I think the way forward there is, how do you, but the way forward is how do you connect together a number of tools to give you that kind of richness of interaction. And that's a really difficult thing to do. A lot of our students say, I just want one platform that does everything, which will never happen. A lot of our students it's like digital wayfinding. One of the things that our students have really struggled with is they literally just don't know where to go online, because there's too many options, and they're here, they're there. So like they've got no perception of where the course exists, because the course has been scattered across the web and it doesn't feel like it's got an anchor point. So that, a mix of platforms is definitely the way forward, but it has to be a very delicate mix. My view is, you know, you probably need one platform in each major kind of interaction. I call them kind of practice genres. So you've got maybe one platform that you use for organizational purposes, and then you've got maybe one platform that you use for collaboration and ideation, and you've got one platform that you use for discussion, or whatever it might be, and you just keep blending them in slightly different orders. So there's not so many platforms to learn that everybody gets exhausted, but actually by blending them in different mixes, you get lots of different modes.
Yes, but still at that point, because even when you see at like a wiki or something like that as a tool, and you try to collaborate, for me, it's also still conditioning. It's not and communities, as I said, it's often also to give an equality to people, but it's not equality that counts, it's equivalence who counts. And then you need, in communities, you need a certain external authority, because it can go wrong. And who would be that external authority? It cannot be the teacher. It cannot be the teacher or coach, because they have there's a power relation between those. And that's why I'm really thinking about the kind of logic and a digital way to do that, and having ongoing conversations with an individual, with a student, on self-respect, on self-reflection, on positioning on the group.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
A very pew.
Yeah, no. I mean, just to kind of sort of step back one step from that. There's one. My way of thinking about that whole territory is to do with what I think of as the tension between. So this is like a sort of big idea, but I think it works, right? Is that a lot of what we're facing is a tension between hierarchies and networks. Okay, hierarchical modes, hierarchical ways of thinking, network modes, network ways of interacting, network ways of thinking. Okay, so an educational institution is hierarchical, and it's that for a reason, if you like. The web is fundamentally at root networked. Okay, and what I see in my work is whenever something contentious happens, it's almost always because there's this tension between a hierarchical mode or way of thinking and a networked mode and way of thinking, and various different people in that conversation are coming from different perspectives, but they haven't necessarily realized it. So now my philosophy on this is not about saying one's better than the other. It's about finding the sweet spot between the two, right? So my institution, we have regulations, we have assessment criteria, we have marking, right? We have all of these things in place. It's incredibly important. If we didn't have that, it would be an incredibly exclusive environment, right? Yeah. But we also have these very, very fluid liminal spaces. We have this idea of the pedagogy of ambiguity, the importance of unknowing, you know, the Vygotskian zone of proximal development, all of this sort of thing. And where it works is where there are educators who have the capability to operate across networked and hierarchical modes. And they're conscious of that, and they get the best out of the hierarchy, and they get the best out of the network, if you like. And that, and I think that that's really important. And you know, and on the other hand, if you have a purely network thing, it's only people like me that seem to benefit from it. And that's a classic art school history thing. Like these horrible experiments in the 60s where a whole of a fine art course was they just lock the students in a room with a box and just leave them there for 4 hours and see what would happen, right? So if it's an entirely fluid environment, if there's no structure, then those who are already privileged just get more privileged.
Yes, and that's the reason why you have to structure it. But not too much, because when you structure too much, you will lose the.
And
so it's
the
indeed
art.
that's it. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. But I will send you the article of my keynote. And please read it and you can comment.
And then I'll send that to the previous person who asked me the question about are there any references on this? And then we're borderline. We're almost. That was it. We're borderline a community of practice in this room already at this rate.
We're already, yes. Well, that's what conferences are good for. Yeah.
Well, it's nice to see it happening. I think it's why the structure of this conference is really nice, because it's actually got this much time. I mean, I know there's only a few of us in the room, but we're all kind of keen on this sort of stuff. And so it's nice that we've got space to have this level of back and forth. Anybody, I mean, I say anybody else, but I feel like we're not in that mode. This is just a conversation. Has anybody got anything that they'd like to add to this conversation? I'll have a look at the chat as well.
I think one of the limiting factors while you're looking, and please interrupt me anytime, but I think one of the biggest limiting factors in these ideas of changing this perception of expectation is our accreditation bodies and what they expect. I don't know what it's like in the UK, but they're very strict on what they expect us to do in our roles as an instructor. And I think that if we can integrate and infiltrate the accrediting bodies, then we do research that we can prove that this is a valuable idea and contribution to education across disciplines, that we could see some movement.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be a kind of regulatory body, isn't there? I mean, I think if I think about UK higher education, then those structures just seem to get more and more and more, or at least that's what it feels like. But I still think at the point of engagement with students, there's an awful lot of latitude still.
Absolutely.
So I think I mean, I'm not being a pessimist. I think but I always think that body will exist and will have that kind of mindset, because it's the pure hierarchical end of things. It's trying to run like a whole national something or other. That's the only mode they have available to them in some senses. So I think it does come back to the network hierarchy thing, which is how do you translate the value of network modes into a language that hierarchy understands. Now, this is one of the reasons why I think our assessment criteria is really good, because it does exist at that intersection. Because, you know, fundamentally we have to. It's not our job to say what good or bad art is. We're there to assess the learning, right? Now, unfortunately, for kind of like I was talking about our attainment gap, I think actually what our attainment gap comes from the fact that we probably don't focus on the learning enough, and we do focus on the artifact too much. So I think it's about using our cunning, if you like, to continue to kind of push forward these educational philosophies, even where they cut against a kind of overall kind of zeitgeist or movement in a particular direction. That's been a tradition within university, this kind of tradition of refusal, and in some cases outright just going in the other direction, has definitely been in higher education in the UK for a long time. I mean, it has corporatized a lot, but I still see it every day, and I'm kind of proud of the fact that my institution, if we say, hey, we've got this new framework or model we'd like you to work to, 80% of the academics go, yeah, I'll do the opposite. And I'll say this in a small room, my old boss said, sometimes you can encourage the university to go in the direction you want it to by actually promoting the opposite of what you want. Because everybody's so contrary. If you say, we want you to do this, they'll go, oh no, we want to do that. And you're like, oh, that's what I want. So that's just very Machiavellian. Maybe I'm part of the problem.
No, I don't think so. I think that they need people like you and me to change.
Yeah, I mean, it's the what I've got this thing that I come back to all the time, which is that education isn't a problem to solve. It is a negotiation. Okay.
Yeah.
It's just like, and I think where it stops working is where people try to solve the problem of education, and you see that coming out of Silicon Valley a lot. They go, "We've got a problem that will solve. We've got this platform that will solve that all of that work and chaos and messiness." And I'm sat there going, the work and the chaos and the messiness, that is what education is. That is the teaching, right? That's where the learning happens. Okay. And so I think that as long as we can hold on to the idea that it's an ongoing kind of negotiation, maybe occasionally a battle, but certainly it's a live practice that constantly needs advocating for, then we'll be okay. I've been quite surprised across all the time I've worked in universities in teaching and learning that actually even at a university you have to advocate for the concept of teaching and learning, otherwise it gradually gets disappeared. But I'm happy to advocate for it. Let's have a look. If anybody else, I mean, if anybody else wants to get onto the mic or ask a question, then please do. It's quite difficult to figure my way through the text chat now because it's I can't remember the context that comments were made in.
Hi, Dave. This is Sandy Smith Andrews.
Hello.
I've been listening intently and wasn't planning to speak, but I just wanted to add to something that you said a moment ago.
Yeah.
About how we get the powers to be, or that be to listen. We've employed at our institution a lead from the back mentality. So if you can get an idea to percolate up high enough that somebody owns it and then acts upon it, and it becomes their idea. And if you don't want credit for it, you can make things happen in a great way.
Yeah. So that's a bottom up rather than a top down way, a sort of grounded theory. I mean, and I think I can see how that would work. I also feel like we have this sort of tension where we talk a lot about wanting to create a kind of risk-based culture. We want people to take risks, and experiment. We want them to be innovative. This is the rhetoric all the time, isn't it? But what I find is that we say, we really want you to take risks. And then if somebody does something, quite often the institution will go, but not like that. No, only the safe risks. So I think sometimes that's the problem. And the sadness for me, I helped run, I'm on the committee for the Digitally Engaged Learning Conference, which I've helped run for about 6 years. And I can remember an early one of those where we asked people about the interesting kind of digital learning projects they'd started up and all the rest of it. And I saw this pattern emerge, which was that in pretty much every single case, there were two things that were true. One was their first attempt went horribly wrong and they had to start again. And the second one was that they kept the thing utterly secret until they felt like it was working enough to be able to reveal it to their institution.
That's typical.
It is typical, but the sadness is it means that the institution never sees the innovation. Mm-hmm. It only sees the successes, right? Mm-hmm. So it's again, I don't really know what the answer to this is, but it's about attempting to create a culture where there's at least enough trust that people are prepared to show they're working. And there's a very, very simple principle there, which it always sort of makes me laugh, which is that the pedagogy that we promote to our students, we never apply to ourselves. Mm-hmm. So we say to our students, take risks, make yourself vulnerable, show us your work in progress. That's where the learning is. But as institutions, that's the opposite of what we do. We keep things secret until we know that they're working, and then we'll go, oh, look at this. And of course I understand why. I just think I guess the question is, how do you create a culture of trust across an entire institution? And that's always a live question, isn't it?
But before I was working, I'm a tech business woman, and it's only 2 years that I teach. And this year I had also to organize an hackathon, an innovation hackathon at school with the students and the teachers. The teachers, it was horrible. I would
Yeah.
say it's really difficult to work with them. I'm sorry. But that's, in fact, it's true. Another thing, I did also some research on different learning communities. And then you see, especially with researchers, academics, and with consultants also, there's always the balance that they have to find between, yes, they have to show that they know something for their profile, for their personal professional profile, but on the other hand, they cannot give all their knowledge away, because that's just what they make the experts. So that's also the balance that's inside the person. That's what I see. I don't say that it's okay, but that's what you see happening. Yeah.
I think you could look. I mean, for me, there's a difference between academia and learning, right? So and I think that the machinery of academia is very particular. You could argue that academia is not necessarily always a shared endeavor, along the lines of what I was saying, despite the fact that it purports to be. I think in many cases it is. I'm always really, I mean, I don't know the details of it, but I'm always impressed with when you see a STEM paper, you know, science, technology, engineering, maths, that's got like 300 authors on it. That always seems, you know, that's quite, you know, it demonstrates that a lot of people were involved. And so I think that that's really positive. But the truth of the matter is that sometimes I think that when a bunch of academics come together, and I'm sure we might identify that way as well, it would be good at the start of the meeting or the session to go, let's just all agree that everybody's really clever and start from there, so that there's not too much performative stuff, and you just get on with the the task in hand. And you know, maybe that's the point, is that I think where it works is where there's an agreed shared endeavor. And sometimes there isn't in academia. Sometimes the endeavor is everybody's career, which is not the same thing as an actual shared endeavor. But yeah, as a rule of thumb, if educational institutions, especially higher education institutions, applied their notional pedagogy to themselves, I think they'd be much more interesting places. Okay, I think should we just run till, should we just do 5 more minutes then? Because then we'll have been sort of Q&Ing for an hour. It feels about right to me. There's still a few people around. I'm going to do a classic pedagogical thing and ask if there's anyone who hasn't said anything yet who wants to say something. Now is your chance. Even, you know, just a reflection or a question, even if it's in a completely different kind of zone from where we've been. I know that's a big ask. Or you can tap it into the text chat. I've
already spoken, but I'm going to jump in again. I have a question. So what is, like, if you were to leave us with one piece of advice to foster your philosophy, what would it be?
Okay, I'm going to actually take the time to think about that. It's towards the end of the day here in the UK, so forgive me. I would say I'm going to come back to that idea of facilitating connections. You know, I think that okay, got there. There's something really, really fascinating that's happened in the last 20-25 years, and it's to do with abundance and scarcity. So I will get around to answering your question. This is the background to it. So it's a huge thing, which is that we've moved from a position where information is scarce to information is abundant, like super abundant. But I'd argue that in a lot of cases, our pedagogy and our institutions still run as if information was scarce, right? let's not forget, 20 years ago, you'd go to university to get into the library. It's a weird thought, right? That's one of the reasons you do it. When I went to university, a lot of people went so they could get on the internet. So that's a blast, isn't it? Whereas now that's all turned upside down. So I'd say my one thought would be, because of the context of abundance, because the point is knowing stuff or having access to stuff is no longer really that valuable. It's what you do with it, isn't it? It's why quiz shows in the UK have changed from questions about remembering the kings and queens of Britain to shows where people are just really witty. I don't know if you've seen QI and things like that. You know, really you get rewarded for playing with knowledge, not just for knowing something, because just knowing something is. So I'd say if I was going to leave you with one thing, it would be, how do we make real that idea that we facilitate connections rather than still attempt to gatekeep knowledge, which is no longer actually within our corral? It's gone, it's left, right? But on a positive note, somebody said to me a few years ago, because I don't want to be negative about it at all, I think it's a massive opportunity. I once did a talk which was called facetiously, now that Wikipedia has done everybody's homework, what's left to teach, right? And my response to that is, because Wikipedia has done everybody's homework, or, you know, the abundance of information, it shifts teaching back to facilitating connections rather than just moving chunks of material around. So it's incredibly liberating. The challenge for us, and this is where I guess a good place to finish up, is how do we do that institutionally? And I think that's been a large part of what our discussion is here, is how do we, because I think whilst our individual practices, individual courses have managed to move in that direction in a lot of cases, perhaps, you know, accelerated by the pandemic, perhaps not. I think the model, the structure, the hierarchy of our institutions is still sort of one whole version of education behind. And that makes sense. It takes a long time for institutions to shift. So I think we can all play a part in helping our institutions to kind of remodel themselves around this opportunity. There's just one caveat to that, which I must say, otherwise I'll annoy myself, which is certainly with higher education, we also need to acknowledge that it's about cultural capital as much as it is about learning. And so I think sometimes we can have these really, really detailed debates about pedagogy, when in actual fact, if you go to certain institutions in the UK, it doesn't matter what you learn, you can just say you went there. Okay, so we've also got to acknowledge that there's a fundamental cultural currency within our educational institutions as well. But nevertheless, I think if we could shift towards genuinely, our curriculum genuinely being about facilitating connections as a collective negotiation, everybody, you know, the world will be a better place, if that isn't too bombastic. Okay, in that case, like I say, it's late in the day here. All right, it's been lovely to meet you guys. I actually feel like I've met you, which is what's really nice about this format. And I know we're a select band now, which is fair enough because we've been doing this for a long time. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and I hope that you find ways of, you know, running with some of these ideas if you found them interesting. Anyway, you know where I am online. Thanks, everyone.